It's a time to look back on this past year, and many of us maybe feel like we've seen too much of this past year. Look forward. But most of all, I think it's a time to just really examine right now, where we are right now, and see for each of us what it is, perhaps, that is waiting to be looked at, waiting within you to be acknowledged, maybe begging for acknowledgement, for us to really examine. I mean, what better time than the end of the year to kind of take stock? And that's what I would like to do a little bit tonight. I'd like to focus on an issue, something that has really seems to come up and be greatly absorbing some of my attention, and maybe for you too. And that is this: there's been a spike, I think, for all of us in invitations to practice, not to practice, become active, to become active in many really very worthwhile social activities, social engagement, from environment and political and just many, many, many different invitations. And for those of us, when those invitations in particular come from people, I think, who are contemplatives in a meditation context, they often come in the form of something like, don't just practice for yourself alone, get out there and do something. I've been getting a ton of emails, kind of, maybe you've been getting a lot of them too. So I agree entirely with the idea that it's important, really important for us to take some kind of action if you feel called for it. And at the same time, I'd like to look at these statements because I've been kind of jostled by these statements and realize there's a lot to notice within that statement. Don't just practice for yourself. Go out and do something. So that's what I want to talk about tonight, and take a look at some of the assumptions that are in these statements. Then the first assumption is, and as I do this, what I'm really heading toward is to invite us to recognize that it is really, we tend to compartmentalize, to think that practice is in one kind of compartment of our life, and action is in another compartment, and never the twain shall meet, as one is at the expense of the other. And this is what the gist of the direction of where I want to go with this tonight. And the first, looking at the assumptions here, and the first assumption is about practice. And let me ask you, when you think of practice, what do you think of? When the spiritual practice, I mean. I think many of us think about it as the time we spend meditating, the time we spend on a chair or on a cushion, or practicing something like loving kindness. We think of it, I think, often as a formal, something we do formally. That's practice. And it's easy to see why. There are many wonderful, powerful practices. And I think many of us have just benefited hugely from them. But I'd like to suggest that it is too narrow an understanding to think of practice only in terms of formal practice. Practice is much more than what you do on a chair or on a cushion or what you do formally, the numbers of minutes or hours you spend a day, a week, or whatever you spend. That's not just what practice is. I don't think that the Buddha certainly ever had that in mind. And as you do more of it, you begin to say, whoa, wait a minute. This isn't the beginning and the end of it. Practice does include formal practice, the number of minutes or hours that you spend on a cushion or on a chair. Yes, but it's not the whole of it. Your practice, to understand it broadly, is actually your life, all of it. Long before you ever came to formal practices, there's something within, I think, each of us that was pulling us, really drawing you, nudging you, whispering, shouting, whatever it was doing, but it was saying, search for this. There's something there, something that you need to look for, which is why I think all of us have ended up here, or maybe on our journey somewhere. We're here right now. We're here now. All of it is practice, the whole part of it. I think when we recognize the scope of what practice is, and I will tell you that in the Zen tradition, they don't call it practice, they call it training. And I like that much better. I like it better because it's broader. You begin to realize, whoa, training, oh, life is training. This whole life is like a school in which we are learning something, we hope, along the way. So when we recognize that the scope of practice isn't just about sitting on a cushion, I think there is a tremendous relief that can happen. We have a different shift in perspective. And what we begin to realize is that, oh, wait a minute, I don't have to, it can relieve you of this comparing mind. Has anybody ever compared your spiritual or practice resume with somebody else's and found yours as kind of pathetic or just middling, You don't have to do that anymore. When you realize that your whole life is your practice, it doesn't matter, even before you came to anything formal doing it, you were practicing, you were being driven, something was calling to you. It's a tremendous relief to realize that. So whatever it is that brought you here, your practice, the good stuff, the bad stuff, the stuff that was you think is a waste of time, all of it. Because you wasted time and all of a sudden you turned around at some point in your life and said, whoa, what am I doing? And you began to move. But it may be required, you needed to, quote unquote, waste that time or make that mistake. Reminds me of a comment made, I used to teach mindfulness to prisoners in men in a maximum security prison in Missouri. And I remember one prisoner, one inmate, he was on death row. And his comment was that if he were still out on the streets, he said he would have been as unhappy, as miserable, as mixed up and suffering as much then, if he were. He said because he was now in, he really came to some deep understandings about himself and about the nature of practice. And I will say that this particular prisoner his sentence was commuted. I mean, the death sentence was commuted. He's still in, but he was in for murder. So it actually kind of raises a question. Does it mean that something like murder is spiritual practice? I mean, if you stop to think about it, I'm saying everything's spiritual practice. Well, I'm not advocating murder, obviously. But it is true that sometimes we need a life-changing event, a shock, to get us to move on. He certainly had one. So I think that this is really a liberating kind of revelation, not to limit your practice to this narrow time you sit on a cushion. It's important to sitting on a cushion or a chair. That's important, but it's not the whole thing. It's not the whole thing. We're each like flowers, I think, every one of us. We bloom, we blossom in our own time. Is it better to be a rose or to be a tulip? If you guys don't think about being a flower, well, think of something else that's more compatible. But it's obvious we all are different and we have our own time. We bloom in our own time. I think there's another second assumption about practice, and that is, particularly in the statement that I just mentioned, don't just sit on your cushion or your chair and practice, but go out and do something. The idea that you can practice and that it would be just for yourself. That's the implication. Don't just do this for yourself. Go out and help others who need it. And granted, many, many, many do. And we can be a benefit to many. But the question is, are you ever practicing just for yourself? I'd like to say no. We don't. We can't practice just for ourselves, because the more you practice, the more you train. The softer your heart gets, the more you open, the more you recognize that what you feel is what everyone feels in one way or another. You begin to see on the inside of yourself, you see on the inside of others. We've talked about this many, many times. Our practice our training is inherently relational. Even if you are a cloistered monk or nun, you're not just practicing for yourself. It is a relationship that is developing with others, a sensitivity, however it is going to be reflected. And I would like to just say, I said our practice is inherently relational. I'm not just talking about relations with other human beings. Our practice opens us to the tenderness of the relationship of all beings. I love the term that Thich Nhat Hanh uses, interbeing. I'm sure many of you have heard that. Interbeing. We inter-are, as he says. We inter-are with all beings. Whether it's another human being, or a dog or a cat, a mouse, an amoeba, a tree, a flower, a plant, a rattlesnake, what's that? A squirrel. Yes, the whole works. All of it is alive. It's all alive. I think maybe all of us are kind of receptive to that, and maybe you already have understood that. But as a society, we don't. I think as a society as a whole, it's been rather conditioned out of us. And I think it's been conditioned out of us. I can think offhand of two big reasons or factors, and one of them is the ancient factor of the Bible. Human beings, men, were given dominion over the planet, over the earth, including women. They were given dominion over women, the whole works, dominion over all of it. And you know what? Men have believed it ever since, right? And believed it ever since. You know, we're kind of just beginning to recognize, wait a minute, maybe it's not quite so, but still, it's pretty strong. And a second incentive that deconditions us from this sensitivity to all living beings is science. For all the incredible wonders of science, we know obviously it focuses on an objective stance toward things. It objectivizes everything. Everything is an object to look at, including ourselves, our emotions. All of it's objects. What's the impact of all of that? The impact is it desensitizes us. We begin to treat things, including ourselves often, as objects. We forget the inherent relational aspect, the inherent sacredness, the connections between all beings. You know, this is a deep part of Native American wisdom, was the connections, the sacredness of all beings. And I will say there is a really beautiful conversation that on NPR, Krista Tippett, on her program on being, she had a conversation sometime in this past year, it's online, with a Native American woman who is also a biologist. Her name is Robin Wall Kimmerer. And what she was talking about is the intelligence in all forms of life. This is really a beautiful talk, but just exactly on this topic. We're all related. We can't not be. And it is up to us, and as we practice, this is what becomes clearer and clearer to us as we do this, as we train. I think, as I said, I think we know it intuitively, and what I thought of as I was thinking on this topic was when I was a child, I remember just I had that intuitive understanding. We had a garden, and what I did is in our garden, I saw each thing was interrelated. It was like a kingdom. And I remember having a ceremony where the king, who in this garden was a sweet gum tree, and the queen, who was a red bud, married each other. And there was this elaborate ceremony with all the shrubs and trees and flowers in our garden. Interrelatedness. I think all of us kind of have that sense. I found a beautiful quote by, let me see if I can find it here. Yes, Mary Oliver, the poet Mary Oliver, in a book that she wrote, not of poems, but of essays called Upstream. She wrote this. She said, I would say that there exist 1,000 unbreakable links between each of us and everything else, and that our dignity and our chances are one. the farthest star, and the mud at our feet are a family. And there is no decency or sense in honoring one thing or a few things and then closing the list. We are at risk together, or we are on our way to a sustainable world together. We are each other's destiny. This is what our practice makes us more and more sensitive to all the time. So again, it's a false idea to think that you can practice just for yourself. It can't be done. It can't be done. Because in fact, you're not just yourself. We are interrelated. And in fact, the further you go into practice, the more you begin to recognize that, whoa, on another level, there's no self there anyway. It's not there. Ultimately, there's no self. And that brings me to another point, or I'd like to focus on right now. I hate to call it a point because it's so much not a point. But that is the assumption that we can easily have, particularly at this time of intense turmoil and contentiousness in the nation and these calls to get out and help and do something and support. We can begin to think that, whoa, everything is so urgent and there's so much to do that, there's no time to look at this ultimate teaching. This teaching, which ultimately is about freedom, liberation. Let me forget that now. Let me concentrate. I do my own quote practice, and I will maybe get out and hopefully work with others. But the ultimate goal of freedom is easy to set by the wayside, I think. It's easy to set by the wayside and think, I'll look at that later on. And many of us are disinclined to look at it anyway. We can be so taken up with our own issues, and that's not a problem, but we can forget that what finally this is all about, ultimately, is about liberation or about freedom. And in that context, it's not even about you or me. It's not about any of us. Now, in fact, this is the hardest part of the teaching to understand. I'm saying words right now. For some of you, I know that it resonates deeply and you got it. You know it. For some of you, you feel it, even if you feel you haven't got it. And for others say, well, okay, heard it again, heard it before, we'll hear it again, and let's go on with life. But I would like to just acknowledge how difficult it is for the mind to grasp that. There's no self. It's all impersonal. And really hard to get. Why? Because it can't be gotten on the level of intellect. You can't think your way into it. No matter how many times you hear someone say it or you read about it, you don't get it until you get it. And there's no saying if and when you'll get it. It only happens when there is a letting go, which is what our practice is about, right? Letting go, letting go, letting go, and poof, sometime, at some point, whoa, you've let go. What a surprise. It's on a level you didn't even know, you didn't think it. So this is where it's all heading. So the question or the invitation is for us not to forget the bigger picture, what this is all about. What it's all about. Ultimately, it's all about this freedom, whether we understand it intellectually, which we won't understand it or not. And I will say that contemplatives, regardless of tradition, throughout the ages have understood that. They've understood what ultimately the path was. It doesn't matter what their tradition. They've all understood it. They understood that on the ultimate level, it's impersonal. It isn't personal. It's not that I and you and all of us are out there. It's that we are out there and at the same time, contradictorily, we are not. I think of it, have thought of it, and I think we've talked about it here sometimes, as dancing. It's like I'm dancing, you're dancing, we're all dancing together. This is all one big impersonal dance that's going on. We dance with whom we like, and we dance with whom we don't like. And we dance with even those who we don't know, never will know. They're out there doing theirs, we're doing ours, and it's all one big dance going on. It gets confusing when we start thinking it in personal terms. I don't like their dance, and they don't like my dance. That's where the confusion comes in. But when we can pull back and recognize, whoa, it's all a dance going on. Doesn't mean we're going to like their dance, maybe never. but you see it from a different perspective. And instead of getting so bound up with disliking their dance, you can see it's a dance. There's a quote that I want to read by a psychologist and writer. I've read it here before, but I really think it's terrific. By Paul Farini, in a book called The Silence of the Heart, Reflections of the Christ Mind. In this, he said, the interactive, he doesn't call it dancing, he calls it bumping. He said, the interactive journey is all about trespass, collision, abuse, call it what you will. It seems to be intentional, but it really isn't. Nobody consciously knows he's going to bump into someone else. It just happens. And then if he's smart, he wakes up and says, oh, sorry, I didn't see you. And his sister says, no problem, I didn't see you either. What else is she going to say? If she takes it personally, she'll say, yes, you did see me, you jerk. What will that prove? It doesn't prove that she was attacked. It just proves that she feels attacked. And that's what you really have out there, a bunch of people who feel attacked. Everyone assigns intention. Everyone thinks he knows the other person's motive, but of course he doesn't. He doesn't even have any idea why somebody bumped into him. It's not the bumping, but the wound that wounds, but the interpretation of the bumping, the condemnation of the bumper, the condemnation of self for being bumped. That's what it is on this ultimate level. And then we get personal about it, and that's where the problem comes in. And of course, we're going to get personal. It doesn't mean that we can't, but to at least understand that this is what's going on. This interpretation up on the level of bumping or dancing, and then the personal interpretation. It's just the way things are. So trying to hold on to this. And you might say, well, how in the world do we hold on to it? Remember the words? Yeah, that's one way. Another way is to always try to embrace. I love this word embracing. That's really, really what this is about. We're trying to embrace it all, what you like and what you don't like. Doesn't mean that you try to like what you don't like. That's not what's being called for. It's growing bigger than what you don't like, holding it with a tender regard, recognizing that it, whatever it is, has probably been here before, will probably be here again in some form or another, old wine, new bottles, again and again. Okay, trying to embrace it all from this point of view of understanding the bigger picture. Understanding the bigger picture. That means, on the first level, embracing all the stuff you don't like about yourself. Like, wow, that's a big one. You know, the disgusting things you don't like, wish you didn't did, you've been trying to get rid of it for a long time, it's still around. Embrace. Recognize it's here right now. Probably going to continue, may continue all your life. Being aware of it and having a tender regard for it. We call it self-compassion, don't we? That's embracing on the internal level. Also, embracing externally. And we don't have to go very far at all to recognize all the things externally that we can't stand and that we find really very, very difficult to think about. Embracing that too. Not asking you to like what you don't like, to love what you hate if you hate, but just embrace it. I think of the roots of, in India, there's a tree. It's called a banyan tree. Some of you may have seen images or know what it is. Tree that is huge and it has a lot of prop roots that it puts down. It also has these roots that spread over everything. And just embrace. Embrace. That's what we can try to be, like a banyan tree. There's a wonderful comment by the late Leonard Cohen. He was asked and talking about this embracing, and here's what he said, really powerfully. He said, "This world is full of conflicts and full of things that cannot be reconciled. But there are moments when we can transcend the dualistic system and reconcile and embrace the whole mess." And that's really what I mean by hallelujah. That regardless of what the impossibility of the situation is, There's a moment when you open your mouth and you throw your arms open and you embrace the thing and you just say, hallelujah, blessed is the name. The only moment that you can live here comfortably in these absolutely irreconcilable conflicts is in this moment when you embrace it all and you say, look, I don't understand a fucking thing at all. Hallelujah. That's the only moment that we can live here fully as human beings. So embracing it all. And when we can't embrace that too. Can't do it now, tomorrow. I'm going to try. Keep trying. So this is about practice. And I started out these comments talking about what seems to me to be formulated amongst many contemplatives as don't just practice for yourself alone, but get out there and do something. So I'd like to devote these last parts of these comments to that idea about getting out there and doing something. And, well, a lot of thoughts come to mind here, but I've been talking about growing bigger than all of this, about understanding the links and not just seeing practice in this narrow little box of sitting on a cushion. You're practicing when you're parenting, you're practicing when you're working with your spouse, when you're, whatever you're doing, or when you are out in the community and working as well. All of it, all of it. So getting bigger, recognizing that social action and practice or spiritual training are not opposed to each other. They're the same thing. I think this concept can be made clearer if we think of social action as service. It's like this hit me this is an ancient understanding, but it like hit me as an insight. You know, we usually talk about social engagement. We talk about engaged Buddhism sometimes. I think engagement is a very cool word. I mean, as opposed to being passionate word. It's a very cool word, engagement. I think service really gets to the heart of what it's all about much more clearly. Service means offering your effort, whatever it may be, and we're all called differently. There's no right way, no wrong way. Offering your effort, whatever it may be, without attachment to it, without an agenda. The word that's often used is selflessly, and that's a high goal. We try our best. You know, we don't go to help someone because later on we think, they're going to be able to help me down the line too. We do, simply because we do. That's service. And when we can think about becoming active, whether it's at home or in your community, as service, it shifts everything. Can you see the shift in perspective when you don't have to think of it as being engaged Buddhism? This is like, well, it's not wrong, but when you think of it as service, you know, the Hindus really understand this. There's a whole path in the Hindu tradition that's called karma yoga, not just the yoga where we're used to taking different postures. Karma yoga is the yoga of service. And as they say so wisely in the Hindu tradition, there's one truth and many paths. And the path of service, activity, is one of those paths to truth, to freedom. When we recognize that, it really begins to integrate things instead of putting it off into little separate components. Another way of thinking about all of this then, or what I'm really saying, is calling on us to recognize it's important to spiritualize your life, not to compartmentalize it, to realize that all of it is of a fabric, and all of it is ultimately your path to freedom, though there is no you. We won't say your path to freedom, right? That's what it's all about. So spiritualizing our life in terms of both our practice, which is relational, in terms of our activity, which can be service, and seeing it as service. Balancing then the contemplative with action, balancing them both. So what is contemplative action? It's a big question. This is what really I think we're being called to look into. Contemplative action. And Thomas Merton, Trappist monk, he died in the 20th century. He, talking about contemplative action, and he was asking and writing about what does it mean? And he says, it means just this. He who attempts to act and do things for the world without deepening his own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give others. He will communicate to them nothing but the contagion of his own obsessions, his aggressiveness, his ego-centeredness, his delusions about ends and means. Really well said, delusions about ends and means. You know, we are really kind of conditioned to have a goal and get to the end. Breaking that up, softening that out, and offering just for the sake of offering. The end isn't in your hands. Yes, we have to have goals on certain levels, but simply offering and serving. So that is one aspect of what this service is. Service action. When we serve, and now I'm just going to say some things that are probably super obvious to you, but I think that need to be said anyway. We serve with the effort at offering loving kindness and compassion. That's what service is. You know, for any of us who go into activity, and particularly if it's, well, I was going to say in your community, but it could be at home as well, there are always going to be differences. And particularly if you get into community activity, whether it's local community or bigger, we're going to meet with a great deal of disagreement, with people who do not agree with us, with anger, perhaps, with contention. The effort is and must be, if we're trying to serve, it needs to be loving kindness. How do you do that? What a huge, huge challenge. How do you serve with loving kindness and not get caught up in the anger or the contentiousness that so many feel? And I won't even try to go into detail. I think we can find it in any kind of issue, cause. There are disagreements. How do we do it? Loving kindness provides the guideline. The Buddha once said, in this world, hate has never yet dispelled hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and inexhaustible. And it remains the law as much today as it was back then 2,500 years ago. It's our guideline, whatever the actions that we try to take. And of course, loving kindness, just another word about it. We've said so much here, so many times. It doesn't mean to be all sappy and emotional, does it? It means an open heart. It means approaching with an open heart. With a soft and tender regard for those who you're working with, even if you don't agree with them. Even if you're angry with them or they're angry with you. So loving kindness and compassion when we serve. There's another aspect of service that I think is important for us to recognize, and that is serving out of a sense not only of loving kindness, but not serving out of a sense of guilt. And I'm bringing up guilt in particular because many of us have had some, I think, uprisings of a sense of guilt. We're doing, I think, as many of you know, many of us are involved in inquiry into white privilege. And it is very easy. A lot of us have done some training with Ruth King, mindfulness, white privilege, and how we who are white, born with white skin, have lived quite unintentionally for most of us, benefited by those who are not white, and we haven't even recognized it. And once we begin to recognize it, as most of us who are studying it, and many of you are also from other conditions, you begin to be horrified, like, whoa, I never intended to do that. Guilt can drive can drive action, trying to catch up, trying to make up. It's not a wholesome motive for service. Kindness, taking responsibility. In one of the little groups that I sat in when we talked about white privilege a few weeks ago, we talked about this word collusion. In fact, everyone who was in that group is here tonight. We talked about the word collusion, which is often used in terms of white people have colluded with this system that had institutionally imposed racism. I think a better word than collusion, because it sounds so intentional, is something like participated in. It's impersonal. We've done it simply because we're born in this society. It has happened. Can we take, and some of us wish to take action there, others don't. What kind of action can we take through kindness and a sense of responsibility that here's a place I need to act? So not out of guilt. So I think that each of us needs to really look inside and investigate our own motives. Are we trying to do something out of guilt or trying to make up? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. When we take action, when we serve, not expecting others to agree, then as we're saying, doing it out of a service, loving kindness. And I think when Martin Luther King talked about beloved community, as he did so beautifully and persuasively, he wasn't talking about everybody agreeing with everybody else, but rather being able to reach across and bridge differences through kindness. And as has been pointed out, he and the other leaders of the civil rights movement at that era were working just as much on them, their own spirituality, their own inner work, as they were working externally as well. This is what we need to do. And so these days, I think there are many, to wind this up, many calls for action. And so many calls, the image I kind of got, you all know that story about the little Dutch boy put his finger in the dike. He put his finger there and it started to spout out on that dike over there and over there. Well, there are only two hands, and it's just all over the place. We can be overwhelmed by this feeling of all that we are called and being called to do. And that too is part of practice. And that is to recognize you can't do everything. Beginning to draw back and make your decisions. So I wanted to end this with another quote by Thomas Merton. And he said, "To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything, is itself to succumb to the violence of our times. Frenzy destroys our inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful." So, thank you for listening. Yeah. And I certainly now want to wish all of us a happy new year, a new year filled with deepening our lives into our spiritual training. And whatever action it is you feel called to take, whether it's right at home and whatever you've always been doing, in the spirit of service. So blessings to all of us. Yeah.